The sun dipped low over the dense canopy of the Redwood Forest, casting long shadows across the tranquil wetland nestled within its heart. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of branches and the distant call of a bird. The wetland, a sprawling maze of reeds, shallow pools, and fallen logs, was a sanctuary for countless creatures, among them 2 herons, one great blue, the other black-crowned, ruled the waters, their rivalry as old as the forest itself. The great blue heron stood motionless at the edge of a pool, its slate-gray feathers blending seamlessly with the twilight. Its sharp eyes scanned the water, waiting for the slightest ripple. Nearby, the Black-Crowned Night Heron perched on a low branch, its obsidian eyes glinting in the fading light. It was smaller but no less formidable, its hunched posture betraying a quiet intensity. Both birds were masters of patience, their stillness a testament to their skill as predators. As the sun vanished, the wetland came alive. Frogs croaked in the reeds, and the surface of the water shimmered with the movements of fish. The great blue heron struck first, its long neck darting forward like a spear. A silver fish wriggled in its beak before disappearing down its throat. The night heron watched, its head tilting slightly, before launching itself into the air with a soft whoosh of wings. It glided to a new spot, closer to the pool's center, and then resumed its vigil. The tension between the 2 birds was palpable. They had shared this wetland for years, their territories overlapping but never merging. Each had learned to respect the other's space, but tonight felt different. The air was charged, as if the forest itself held its breath. A sudden splash broke the silence. Both herons turned their heads, their eyes narrowing. A river otter surfaced, its sleek body glistening as it clutched a fish in its paws. The otter's presence was an intrusion, a disruption of the delicate balance. The great blue heron took a cautious step back, while the night heron shifted uneasily on its perch. The otter, oblivious to their unease, devoured its catch and slipped back into the water. Minutes passed, and the tension eased until a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. The herons froze, their instincts screaming danger. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of underbrush. A mountain lion emerged from the shadows, its golden eyes glowing in the dim light. It moved with deliberate grace, its gaze fixed on the otter, now swimming nervously in the center of the pool. The herons, though not the lion's target, were caught in the crossfire. The great blue heron spread its wings, ready to take flight, but the night heron remained still, its eyes locked on the predator. The lion crouched, its muscles coiled like springs, and pounced. The otter dove just in time, but the lion's claws raked the water, sending a spray of droplets into the air. The wetland erupted into chaos. Birds took to the sky, their cries piercing the night. The great blue heron finally launched itself into the air, its wings beating furiously as it sought safety. The night heron, however, did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing, it dropped from its perch and landed on a nearby log, its dark feathers making it nearly invisible in the gloom. The lion, frustrated by its failed hunt, turned its attention to the night heron. It crept closer, its movement slow and deliberate. The heron didn't flinch. It stood its ground, its eyes never leaving the lion's. For a moment the 2 predators faced each other, the tension so thick it seemed to crackle in the air. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the night heron lunged. Its beak struck the lion's nose, drawing a yelp of surprise. The lion recoiled, shaking its head, and the heron took advantage of the distraction to leap into the air. It flew low over the water, its wings skimming the surface, before disappearing into the reeds. The lion, now wary, retreated into the forest, its growls fading into the distance. The wetland fell silent once more, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. As dawn approached, the great blue heron returned to its perch, its feathers ruffled but unharmed. The night heron emerged from the reeds, its movements slow and deliberate. For the first time, there was no tension between them. They stood side by side, their rivalry momentarily forgotten, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. But the peace was short-lived. A new sound reached their ears. A low, rhythmic thrumming that grew louder with each passing second. The herons turned their heads, their eyes narrowing as a helicopter appeared above the treetops. It hovered for a moment before descending, its blades whipping the water into a frenzy. The herons took flight, their wings beating in unison as they soared above the wetland. Below, the helicopter landed and figures emerged. Humans in uniforms carrying equipment. They moved with purpose, their voices carrying over the noise of the engine. The herons circled once before disappearing into the forest, their sanctuary no longer their own. The wetland, once a haven of balance and harmony, had been invaded. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light on the scene below, the herons' dance came to an end, their story forever changed by the arrival of an unseen force. The forest, ancient and enduring, watched silently, its secrets buried deep within its roots. But for the herons, the dance was over, and the future uncertain. The herons flew deeper into the forest, their wings cutting through the cool morning air. The great blue heron led the way, its long neck stretched forward, while the black-crowned night heron followed closely behind. They moved with purpose, their instincts guiding them to a new sanctuary, though the unease in their movements was unmistakable. The forest around them seemed to close in, the towering redwoods casting long shadows that flickered like ghosts in the early light. They reached a smaller, secluded wetland, hidden deep within the forest. The water here was still, undisturbed by the chaos they had left behind. The great blue heron landed gracefully on a moss-covered log, its sharp eyes scanning the area for threats. The night heron perched on a low branch nearby, its dark feathers blending into the shadows. For a moment they simply watched and listened, their bodies tense, their senses heightened. The forest was quieter here, the usual sounds of life muted. Even the frogs and insects seemed to hold their breath, as if aware of the intrusion that had disrupted the balance of their world. The herons, though safe for now, could not shake the feeling of being watched. The presence of the humans lingered in their minds, a foreign and unsettling force that had no place in their ancient dance. As the hours passed, the herons resumed their routines. The great blue heron waded into the shallow water, its movements slow and deliberate as it hunted for fish. The night heron remained on its perch, its eyes scanning the water for signs of movement. But the tension between them had shifted. The rivalry that had once defined their relationship seemed trivial now, overshadowed by the shared threat they had faced. The sun climbed higher, its light filtering through the canopy and dappling the water with golden patterns. The forest began to stir, the sounds of life returning as the animals adjusted to the new rhythm of the day. Yet, the herons remained vigilant, their instincts telling them that the danger was not over. Then it happened. A low rumble echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakable. The herons froze, their heads turning toward the sound. It grew louder, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the trees. The great blue heron took to the air, its wings beating furiously as it soared above the canopy. The night heron followed, its smaller frame darting through the branches with agility. From their vantage point they could see it, a line of machines cutting through the forest, their metallic jaws tearing into the earth. Trees fell like dominoes, their ancient trunks no match for the relentless force of the machines. The humans moved alongside them, their voices carrying over the noise, their presence a stark contrast to the natural world they were destroying. The herons circled above, their cries piercing the air. Below, the forest was being ripped apart, the delicate balance of life shattered in an instant. The wetland they had fled to was no longer safe. The machines were moving closer, their path unyielding. The great blue heron let out a mournful call, its voice echoing through the trees. The night heron responded, their cries blending into a haunting symphony of loss. They flew higher, their wings carrying them away from the destruction. But there was no escape. The forest, their home, was being erased before their eyes. As they flew, the herons passed over the remnants of their old wetland. The once thriving ecosystem was now a wasteland, the water murky and lifeless, the reeds trampled and broken. The animals that had once called it home were gone, their absence a silent testament to the devastation. The herons continued their flight, their movements growing slower as exhaustion set in. They searched for a new sanctuary, a place untouched by the humans and their machines. But the forest seemed smaller now, its boundaries closing in. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to open sky. Below them stretched a vast expanse of water, a lake shimmering in the sunlight. It was unfamiliar territory, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The herons descended, their wings skimming the surface of the water as they landed on a rocky outcrop. For a moment they simply stood there, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The great blue heron stretched its neck, its eyes scanning the horizon. The night heron perched beside it, its dark feathers ruffled by the breeze. The lake was quiet, its surface undisturbed. The herons began to explore, their movements cautious as they adjusted to their new surroundings. But even here, the shadow of the humans loomed. In the distance, a boat appeared, its engine humming as it cut through the water. The herons took flight once more, their cries echoing across the lake. They flew higher and higher, their wings carrying them toward the horizon. But as they disappeared into the distance, one question remained. Where could they go where the humans would not follow? The forest, once a sanctuary, was no more, and as the herons vanished into the sky, their dance came to an end, a silent testament to the fragility of the natural world and the relentless march of progress. The forest, ancient and enduring, watched silently, its secrets buried deep within its roots. But for the herons, the dance was over, and the future uncertain. The herons flew for what felt like an eternity, their wings aching, their breaths shallow. The lake behind them grew smaller, its shimmering surface now just a distant memory. Ahead, the landscape shifted, rolling hills, sparse woodlands, and eventually a sprawling marshland that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air here was thick with the scent of salt and decaying vegetation, a stark contrast to the fresh, earthy aroma of the Redwood Forest. The great blue heron led the way, its keen eyes spotting the marsh as a potential refuge. The Black-Crowned Night Heron followed, its smaller frame struggling to keep up. They descended slowly, their wings catching the breeze as they glided toward the marsh. The ground below was a patchwork of water and reeds, dotted with small islands of grass and mud. It was unfamiliar, but it was alive, a place where they could rest, if only for a while. The herons landed on a narrow strip of land, their feet sinking slightly into the soft mud. The great blue heron stretched its neck, scanning the area for threats. The night heron perched nearby, its dark feathers blending into the shadows of the reeds. For a moment, they simply stood there, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The marsh was teeming with life. Frogs croaked in the reeds, their voices a constant hum in the background. Fish darted through the shallow water, their silvery bodies glinting in the sunlight. Dragonflies hovered above the surface, their iridescent wings catching the light. It was a vibrant, chaotic ecosystem, a stark contrast to the quiet, orderly world they had left behind. The herons began to explore, their movements slow and deliberate. The great blue heron waded into the water, its sharp eyes scanning for fish. The night heron stayed closer to the reeds, its hunched posture betraying its wariness. They hunted in silence, their rivalry momentarily forgotten as they focused on survival. But the marsh was not without its dangers. As the sun began to set, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the marsh shifted. The frogs fell silent, and the water grew still. The herons, though exhausted, remained vigilant. Their instincts told them that the night would bring new challenges. And they were right. As darkness fell, a new predator emerged, a large alligator, its eyes glowing in the moonlight as it slid through the water. The herons froze, their bodies tense as they watched the creature approach. The alligator moved slowly, its massive body creating ripples in the water. It was a formidable opponent, one that even the herons, with their sharp beaks and quick reflexes, could not easily defeat. The great blue heron took to the air, its wings beating furiously as it soared above the marsh. The night heron followed, its smaller frame darting through the reeds. They flew higher and higher, their cries piercing the night as they sought safety. But the alligator was not their only concern. As they flew, they noticed something else. A faint glow in the distance, a light that seemed out of place in the natural world. They flew toward it, their curiosity outweighing their fear. What they found was both surprising and unsettling. The glow came from a small cabin, its windows illuminated by the soft light of a lantern. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air. The herons circled above, their sharp eyes taking in the scene. A human stood outside, their figure silhouetted against the light. They were holding something, a net, perhaps, or a tool of some kind. The herons hesitated, their instincts torn between curiosity and fear. They had learned to associate humans with danger, but this place seemed different. The cabin was small and isolated, its presence almost blending into the landscape. The human moved slowly, their actions deliberate and unhurried. As the herons watched, the humans set down their tool and began to scatter something on the ground. Seeds, perhaps, or food. A group of small animals emerged from the shadows, their movements cautious as they approached. The humans stepped back, allowing the animals to eat in peace. The herons, though wary, felt a glimmer of hope. This human was different, a caretaker, perhaps, or a protector. They descended slowly, their wings catching the breeze as they landed on a nearby tree. The human noticed them immediately, their eyes widening in surprise. For a moment there was silence. The human and the heron stared at each other, their worlds colliding in a way that felt both strange and inevitable. Then the human smiled. A small, gentle gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between them. The herons stayed there for the rest of the night, their bodies finally relaxing as they watched the human tend to the marsh. It was a fragile peace, one that could be shattered at any moment, but for now, it was enough. As dawn approached, the herons took to the air once more, their wings carrying them toward the horizon. The marsh, though unfamiliar, had offered them a brief respite, a reminder that even in a world dominated by humans, there were still pockets of kindness and hope. But the question remained: how long would it last? The herons flew on, their cries echoing across the marsh as they disappeared into the distance. The forest, the wetland, the marsh, all were part of a world that was changing faster than they could adapt. And as they vanished into the sky, their dance continued, a silent testament to the resilience of life and the enduring spirit of the natural world. The forest, ancient and enduring, watched silently, its secrets buried deep within its roots. But for the herons, the dance was far from over. and the future, though uncertain, was still theirs to shape. The herons flew onward, their wings cutting through the crisp morning air. The marshland faded behind them, replaced by a sprawling coastal landscape where the forest met the sea. The scent of salt water filled their nostrils, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore echoed in their ears. This was a new frontier, a place where land and water intertwined in a delicate balance. The great blue heron led the way, its sharp eyes scanning the coastline for a safe place to land. The black-crowned night heron followed closely, its smaller frame struggling against the coastal winds. They descended toward a rocky outcrop that jutted into the sea, its surface dotted with tide pools and seaweed. It was a harsh environment, but it offered food and shelter, two things the herons desperately needed. As they landed, the herons were immediately struck by the difference in this new world. The air was cooler, the sounds sharper. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the roar of the waves. Crabs scuttled across the rocks, their claws clicking against the stone. The herons, though exhausted, began to explore, their movements cautious as they adjusted to their new surroundings. The great blue heron waded into a tide pool, its long legs navigating the uneven terrain with ease. It struck quickly, snatching a crab from the water and swallowing it whole.